Okay, so we now know when a user taps a button on the screen. When they press it, they get some reasonable feedback. And we also know that we get some code in here that will be ran whenever they tap on the button itself. When they press it though, we need to start the timer up at the top. To start our timer and record the amount of time that's elapsed, we're going to make use of the concept called state. Now there's a lot of confusion that floats around the React community about state, and it's particularly challenging for beginners to pick up. This is another one of those topics where people can explain it to you, but until you start to kind of struggle with it a little bit and work through some examples, that's when you really start to master it. Nonetheless, we're going to work through a couple apps and come to rely on state really heavily, and it's my hope that you'll get pretty darn familiar with it over time. So let me sum up what state is as concisely as I can. State is an object that we use to track and respond to users' input. So state is a JavaScript object. Each component that we create has its own instance of state. So although we are defining stopwatch here, anytime I create a stopwatch component, and I might have multiple, I will have multiple instances of state, and each stopwatch I create has its own instance. It's not shared. The most important thing to recognize about state is that whenever we update our state, it causes our component and any components nested inside of it to re-render. So that last part is extremely important, and it's how we update all of our views in React with new data. Whenever we change state, our component re-renders. One last thing, whenever we use state in a component, as a rule of thumb, we should always default our state to some reasonable values. So enough of the academic style definition here. Let's actually make use of this and try to figure out what the heck is going on. So when a user clicks on the start button, our handle start press function runs. And we want to record the current time so that we will have the ability to tell how much time has elapsed, and that's going to allow us to figure out what time to show for the timer up here. So to record that start time, we're going to create a property on our state called start time, time elapsed. Let's initialize that state property by creating a new function called getInitialState. And we always define that at the top of our component. So in the same way that render is a special function that is called by React, getInitialState works the same way. GetInitialState is ran by React exactly one time when the component is first created. Whatever we return from this object is going to be what our state is equal to, so it's going to be you can really read getInitialState as initial state for this component. What's the default? What's the starting settings for our component? We always have to return an object from this function. And usually it's going to be as simple as this right here. It'll be return, an object, and then just some properties inside. If you're starting to put logic inside of getInitialState, that's definitely something you want to avoid. Your getInitialState function should almost never have any logic inside of it. It should really just be an object that gets returned. So again, any object that we return from here is going to be our initial state. So we're going to add a time elapsed property that's going to start out as just null. So again, we can kind of read this as when this component is first created, we will have some initial state. That initial state will be time elapsed null. Okay. Let's go back down to our event handler, handle start press. I'm going to go ahead and delete the console login here and just give us a little bit of white space to work with. Now, we want to somehow record the time at which the start button is pressed as our time elapsed, or we want to somehow record that time, right? So we'll start off by saying var start time equals new date. So whenever the user taps start button, our start time is going to be the time at which they press that button. And this new date object here is accurate down to the millisecond. So it's definitely the appropriate accuracy that we need for our app here. Next, we're going to go ahead and update our state to reflect the start time here. So we'll write this.setState, and we pass it an object. Inside of here, we're going to write time elapsed, and that's going to be new date minus start time. Now, I know what you're thinking here. Stephen, we're writing basically new date minus new date. And yes, you're totally correct. That really doesn't make any sense at all. Just bear with me to the next section. One thing that I want to draw your attention to here especially is the use of this function, this.setState. You'll notice that we didn't do this.state.time elapsed. So once we have some initial state, we can reference it by calling this.state. So when our component is first rendered, you can kind of imagine here that this.state.time elapsed will be equal to null. You'll notice that one thing that we did not do was something that looks like this. This is probably the single biggest no-no, never do, inside of React. We never ever update our state by calling this.state. Whatever property equals some new value. We should always and only update our state by calling this.setState and providing it an object with our property and the new value that we want to be placed there. So we'll say update our state with some new value. Again, this is the only way in which we should ever update our state in a React component. Never by saying this.state.time elapsed equals some new value. Okay, so with all those rules in place, let's continue on to the next section and make some sense out of this kind of weird looking code here.